today I would like to talk a little bit about Les Petits Fairies, which are the fairies of a small little island just off the Normandy coast called Jersey. It's a British Crown dependency, it's where I grew up, and at the moment I'm researching a book chapter on the Jersey fairies, and it's just really exciting to learn a little bit about my heritage. So I thought I'd share some of the more interesting Jersey fairy stories. So there's lots of names for fairies in the Channel Islands, Les Petits Fairies being one of the names used in the patois of Jersey, which is called Gériès, and it's sort of part French but a different version of French. We also have a really interesting term in Jersey and also in some parts of France called poucalets. Poucalets are referred to their sort of ancient menhirs, cromlechs, ancient Neolithic sites, and in Jersey and in the Channel Islands they are highly connected to fairies. There have been several ideas about what poucalet means, and various folklorists have come up with different ideas, but there seems to have been a semblance that a guidebook in 1841 suggested, which meant it was from the Celtic word puca, meaning fairy, and the word for place, the Celtic word for place, le. This has remained the dominant theory of the word of origin ever since, becoming somewhat of a tradition in itself. Everyone seems to think that the word poucalet essentially means fairy place. Stevens and Arthur in Jersey place names suggested that it meant a goblin path or stone. Fairies are highly connected with the dolmens and the ancient sites of Jersey, and we have many beautiful dolmens to visit if you ever do go to the island. They are haunted by fairies, and the fairies aren't these sort of gauzy wingy fairies we might imagine from, I don't know, Mary Cecily Barker or the flower fairies of the wayside, something like that. These are dark fairies. So if you're walking past a dolmen at midnight, these fearsome goblin creatures will seize you and make you dance until you die. One of my favourite folk stories related to Jersey is the tale of St Brelard's Bay Church, which was moved by the fairies. The first reference we have to this was found in an account of Jersey by a man called Please in 1824, and he mentioned that fairies moved the site of the parish church. Now, what I found is throughout the Victorian era, in various guidebooks to Jersey, the story has become more and more elaborated, and eventually we end up with a whole legend surrounding the how the fairies moved the foundation stones of St Brelard's Bay. Now, the church is situated in a beautiful spot, but it's rather unusual because it's away from the population. So you'd expect a church to be a parish church to be built near to the parishioners, but this is sort of away from the population. So parishioners, I suppose, came up with their own explanation of why their church was where it was. And the story runs, there was a overseer, a chief builder called Grondin, and the parishioners obviously decided to build the church at Waynay on the east side of St Brelard's Bay, and Grondin told his men to start building, and they laid all the foundation stones, and they went home that evening very tired but excited that they'd finished their day's work. And overnight the stones from the intended site of the church vanished, and the men went hunting for all their tools and the stones, and they found them on the other side of the bay where the church is currently situated. So they had to spend the rest of the whole day lugging all the stones and all their tools back to the site where they wanted to build the church. They went home the next night very tired, but lo and behold again, the following night the fairies had decided to move all their stones and all their tools to the site where the fairies had chosen for the church. On the third night, being suspicious, Grondin decides to go to sleep with a flask of brandy, to guard the stones, the foundation stones. So he sits up all night and watches, and on the stroke of midnight, an old man in fantastical dress appears to Grondon and says, "Why are you disturbing this site? This is a fairy site." And there's a theme in British folklore that fairies are forever vanishing, and one very, very funny poem mentions that the fairies are in Jersey, and it's the last place where they are, and because Grondon has decided to build on their last site, they're going to then have to travel to the moon. So Grondon is told off by this fairy man, and all the stones are moved again. The fairies tie Grondon up, and there's another version of this story where the queen of the fairies, she's tiny, and she comes and runs her little cartwheels over Grondon's face. So after the third night, and after Grondon's encounter, the parish of St Prelard's Church gets built on the current site where it is. So the fairies chose the site of that church. Another one of my favourite stories about the fairies of Jersey probably comes from a Victorian guidebook. There's no evidence of it written before, this man called Octavius Rooke wrote in 1856. But it's a lovely little legend. It's about something called the Fontaine Emmet, which is sort of on the ragged north coast of the island, up at a place called Belhoog, which is up by nearby an area called Egypt. So the tale goes that there are two fairies called Anna and Euna, and they dwelt in a grotto. And God has given them several hundred years to live in this grotto in Jersey, but eventually, after their time was up, an angel came to recall them back to heaven. So the fairies are so sad to leave the beautiful island of Jersey that they cry, and because their tears are immortal and sinless, they fall down and their tears become a spring, which is referred to as Fontaine Emmet. This spring is said to be able to give people that can't speak the power of speech, and also cure sore eyes. That tradition is actually quite old, and the idea that it was a healing spring, I think, goes way before Octavius Rooke's legend that he dedicated to that beautiful spring. So that's another really, really sweet little fairy story. We also have a whole raft of stories from the wild and windy parish of St One, which I think is quite apt. Fairies tend to like spaces that are quite wild and liminal, and St One's is certainly one of those wild parishes with its large rolling sand dunes and huge beach. So there was a doctor called Dr. Simmons who was sort of going around asking various members of the parish about the little folk of Jersey back in 1913, and he recorded some really, really interesting oral folk tales about fairies. So one of them was a fairy funeral. So one night at 10 o'clock, Captain Vautier was driving past the large manor at St One's, and he saw a whole bunch of fairies carrying a coffin. They spooked his horse, and the horse refused to move, and he saw the fairies vanishing away, and after that his horse would move on. Fairy funerals are quite a common theme in England, so we wonder whether it's a cultural link with England, that one. There's also, fairies have a liking to silver. So fairies were said to haunt a lane called Sous à Thiebaut by Latac, and their fairies were, their fairy horses were said to have silver shoes. We also have a tale of a man called James Ballash, who was taken on fondly by the fairies, and one day he was just ploughing his field up as any farmer would, and suddenly the fairies turned his plough tip and the shoes of his horses into silver, and that led to a local saying that I will have my horse shod like James Ballash's, i.e. I'm going to have my horse with really good horseshoes. Down at St One's there's also 3 really prominent standing stones called the Field of 3 Stones, and there's a tale that the fairies carried these in huge aprons that looked like Masonic aprons, and these the fairies did this to scare the Turks. Now this sounds quite quirky, but looking behind the evidence, it looks like there were sort of Turkish pirates operating in the region, so it might be linked to that. And also, Guernsey fairies were also said to carry big menhir standing stones in aprons. We've got one case of the fairies' battledore in Guernsey, and a fisherman one night was just walking home and saw a tiny lady carrying this huge stone in her apron while knitting. So he hid behind a hedge, and the lady then took the big stone out of her apron and placed it where it currently stands.